Hello everyone, welcome to Keen Ear. So for this video I'm going to be doing something I guess a little different, which is to compare and contrast the fortunes and I guess misfortunes as well of two music icons, David Bowie and Mark Bolan. And in many ways it's a similar sort of deal really with the Beatles and the Stones. During the 1960s, there was this friendly rivalry between them. And I truly believe that if it wasn't for this rivalry, uh, I guess the Stones wouldn't have been as good as they were because of the Beatles, and I guess vice versa as well. And it's very much the same for Bowie and Bolan as well. I don't think Bowie would have been as quite as good without Bolan, and vice versa and that kind of thing. So yeah, I guess it was a mutually beneficial rivalry going on, and it was I think integral really for their success. Each individual success. So let's start off in the earliest sort of recordings we can kind of go really, and it's kind of surprising. At first when I heard how far back David Bowie went, initially, it was a bit of a shock. The first recording between Bowie and Bolan goes to Bowie, which came out in 1964, which is, a lot of people think, oh, Bowie started in the early 70s. He didn't. It took years and years for him to get to the early 70s when he had his first bit of proper success. But it was a long, long road to get there, and he was toiling away for years. So 1964 was the first year for Bowie. 1965 saw the first release for Bolan. So there was very little between them. So neither of them really, you could argue, were ahead of each other greatly at this point in time. And really, at this time, the 1960s was a time where Bowie especially started to kind of learn, a certain degree of craft to the way he would obtain the fame that he so obviously greatly wanted. This was very much his apprenticeship to becoming a superstar, I guess, because I've heard lots of reports about Bowie at this time. He'd be kind of not necessarily the best person in the sense that he'd hang around with a bunch of people. He'd learn what he'd need to learn. He'd exchange information, and he'd get like a leg up from somebody in the industry, and he'd get connections and that kind of thing, and then he'd kind of move on. He'd kind of push somebody to the side and then move on to somebody else and then kind of do the same thing to them. And this is something that Bowie would continue to do even after he became a superstar. He'd associate with a certain producer and then move on to a different one, and then he'd move on to like a guitarist or a songwriter or whatever, and then he kind of move on. He's always moving on to the next thing. And I guess that was something he learned early on, to keep moving. And he was kind of quite ruthless. He definitely hurt quite a few people doing this. He'd receive letters from people who said, "Oh, I haven't seen you in, a year. How are you doing?" And he wouldn't respond. He's like, "Oh," and that was something that I've heard him do in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. He'd kind of just he just developed it over time. It was kind of very rare. The likes of Brian Eno, he sort of hung around with him in the in the late 70s, sorry, and then he kind of brought him back later on. But it was very rare for him to kind of go back. Really, he'd kind of drop you and move on. So yeah, that's kind of the start really of that sort of mindset that Bowie in particular had. But well, there Bolan was no stranger to this kind of practice either. There's the John Peel. I read John Peel's autobiography, in which he talks about being friends with Bolan and hanging out with him, and and in exchange for I guess his friendship, John Peel would play Bolan's music on the radio, and that would get him more fans and sell more records. And then as soon as Bolan felt like he'd got as much as he can kind of get out of Peel, he kind of just left him really and just didn't really interact with him anymore, and kind of moved on to other people. So yeah, he was the same really. But then again, you've got to kind of ask yourself, is there any different for any other musician? Is there any different for any film star or anything else? Any other successful people? I think it's kind of the way it kind of works really. That's the game that's played really. And I think Bowie in particular was like a master of this craft, more so than Bolan was to a degree. But anyway, nothing really happened in the 1960s, the earlier part of the 60s. for Bowie and Bolan, 64, 65, 66. They were kind of just struggling with a few 45s here and there, and not really making any real impact. Then in 1967 came the first album to be released, which again went to David Bowie, and this came out, I believe, the same day as Sergeant Pepper. And the idea that this was a competitor to Sergeant Pepper is a real joke. The idea you go into a record shop in 1967 and walk past Sergeant Pepper and think, I don't want Sergeant Pepper, this revolutionary, amazing album. What I want is David Bowie's, first LP, self-titled. It's kind of a bit of a joke, really. And this album, it had a very short print run, and then it was quickly, you know, dropped, and Bowie wasn't offered another contract. And it's kind of amazing, really, how David Bowie, this was his first big chance, his first album to come out. How he ever thought he was gonna kind of take over the world, sort of thing, with this, I have no idea, because this is, I've never heard an album with so many ideas, and all of them pretty much are, not very good. It's kind of amazing. There's so many misfires on this. It's kind of staggering, really. In fact, it probably does break the world record for the most amount of misfires on an album, really. By a such a talented musician. So yeah, a real a real misstep, really. And I think the problem with this album at this point in time is that Bowie was just so far behind his main competitor. He was so far behind, like, the Beatles, and he was so far behind the Stones and the Kinks and pretty much everyone, really. He was sprinting to keep up, but it just wasn't there. For somebody who was known for being ahead of the game at this point in time, it really wasn't. So he needed to keep sprinting to kind of get there, and eventually he'd get there. But at this point in time, he was lagging behind, and he was huffing and puffing, and not really in the race at all, to be honest. So that album flopped, and it was back to the drawing board for David Bowie. So we move forward a year to 1968, and the first album from Bolan came out under Tyrannosaurus Rex, and yeah, this had some success to it. The fact is, this is an original copy of this album. Unlike, David, but I'd never be able to afford a copy of this, an original one. This is a seriously hard to find record. It was deleted very soon after it came out, but this is actually quite, it's not easy to find by any means, but it's a lot easier to find than our album. So I can say with some degree of confidence that this album, My People Fair Not Sky in Their Hair, but Now They're Content to Wear Stars on Their Brow, is a more successful album than but without looking at the sales figures or anything like that, I can kind of just guess that it is. So yeah, Bolan went for this route to obtain his rock star uh, sort of goal, really. That's kind of all that Bolan really wanted to be. He just wanted to be a rock star. That was it. He was kind of single-minded, I guess, in that regard. Whereas Bowie was a bit different. Bowie wanted to be, yeah, he wanted to be a rock star. But if that didn't work out, there was the acting, roles that he was kind of thinking about. He was thinking about becoming a film actor or a stage actor or a TV guy, or even a TV personality, which kind of comes into place later on. There's an ironic twist to the tale, but yeah, hopefully I remember to work that in later on. But yeah, he had other ideas, but Bolan was much more focused on being a rock star, and this was the way he thought about obtaining that rock star status that he wanted so much. By being a hippie, effectively. The hippie era in the late '60s, he jumped on that bandwagon, full force. And the thing is with Bolan is that he did pretty much create the glam rock era into the early '70s, and so many people jumped on that bandwagon. But the fact is, a few years earlier, Bolan himself was jumping on the bandwagon himself. He didn't start the hippie craze. He was just riding it for all it was worth, and as a way of getting somewhere, just as people would be doing in the early '70s. So yeah, he's just as much a bandwagon rider as anybody else, because he wasn't. A lot of people, who knew him at the time, kind of suspected that he was a bit of a fake. Really, he wasn't really a proper hippie. He wasn't really in the a true usually with hippies they can kind of see through people and see who was really on their wavelength and that kind of thing. And Bolan, there was something, I guess, a little bit off with him, I guess, to a certain degree. And the way that he was very sort of very much in control of this Tyrannosaurus Rex output. He was in a group. There was two guys in the group. Steve Peregrine Took, and Took never got a word in edgeways. It was very much Bolan's project, and Bolan was pulling all the strings. And if whenever Took would come forward with any material, it would get completely denied and wouldn't even get a look in of anything. So yeah, very unhippie-ish sort of mentality that Bolan had, very sort of selfish, I guess, in that regard, which is not really akin to the hippie kind of ideology, I guess. So yeah, but Bolan had the first bit of success on an album, or just sort of generally really with this, not great success, but some success. So on balance, Bolan at this point was a bit of ahead of the game, with these sorts of albums, these Tyrannosaurus Rex records he was putting out. Mostly their albums were a decent success. The 45s, not quite so much. But one of the things that was happening at this time was, for Bolan, was that he was selling records. He was doing better than Bowie, but then again, pretty much everyone was doing better than Bowie at this point. But he wasn't getting to the higher statures that he was wishing to get. He wasn't getting that rock star lifestyle as much as he wanted, and the main reason for that is because his fan base were largely made up of hippies, and hippies don't really have a great deal of money, so they weren't really rushing out to buy the records because they didn't really have the cash to buy all these expensive LPs that Bolan was putting out. So he was kind of getting a bit frustrating. You kind of hear as you go through the Tyrannosaurus Rex records, the rock element kind of creeping in as he tries to make the music more and more mainstream with every release. He's kind of hinting at where he's kind of going with every album. So nobody's had any real great success at this point, up to the late 60s, but just little bits here and there, I guess, in terms of Bolan anyway. But then first bit of success comes about in 1969 for David Bowie. David Bowie's arguably the first one to have any real hit records. Um, this is Space Oddity, the reissue anyway. But the album itself, from 1969, that self-titled that Bowie put out, second self-titled album. Yeah, it was a bit of a flop. It didn't do all that great, but the single Space Oddity did do pretty well, and it was a hit record. And Bowie, at this point in time, was pretty terrified, really, of becoming a one-hit wonder. That was one thing that truly terrified him. And that was something as well, along with the rivalry, of course, of Bolan, which I've already talked about, was something that pushed him to become better, I guess, and to really focus on what he was doing and get his act together, really. And when this album came out, originally in '69, it was definitely a huge upgrade from his first album. It's light years ahead, and he really needed to move as far away from that first album as much as he could, really. And this is like this is the start of Bowie as we kind of know him, really. The first album was just a bit of a curio and nothing really else. A bit of I wouldn't say a bit of a misstep. It was a huge kind of misstep, and it kind of pulled him back. It held him back for quite a while. I think he would have been more successful earlier on without that album if it was just released in a different way. We came with different material or whatever, a different sort of idea surrounding the album as a whole, and a better idea. But at this point in time, he put out a hit single, and it was starting to maybe the hard work was starting to pay off, but he was still terrified of becoming a one-hit wonder. And I've heard actually kind of recently that Bowie, he grew to hate Space Oddity because he considered it nothing more than a cash in, of a global event, the moon landing and everything. And he kind of couldn't really wait to, move on and do something different and that kind of thing. And it's one of his most defining songs, of course, but it's a song that, I guess there was some resentment towards it, and there was some need to kind of, move on and do better things, I guess. And I guess that was a driving force as well for his success as well. And then in a year later, 1970, 71, I believe this came out in the UK a little bit later on, but it's 1970 in America. I believe it came out in America first, which is a weird thing, I guess, because it was on the Mercury label. I believe the Mercury label is an American label. But anyway, this came out soon after Space Oddity, and this one didn't hit the mark either. You know, it's Bowie kind of trying to do a more hard rocking sound that was popular at the time. It didn't hit the mark. But I think this is a great album. Again, this is a huge improvement. You know, in a matter of a few years, he managed to greatly expand his sound. And, a lot of people talk about the Beatles, for instance. You know how much they improved and how much they changed their sound, but you know, Bowie did it in just as a remarkable way, really. But he did it kind of in the background, because nobody was really paying too much attention to any of these albums, really, particularly this one. So yeah, it was pretty remarkable, really. So around the same sort of time, 1970, as the 1970s drew on, Bolan was kind of getting a bit sick of being kind of, I guess, held back by the hippie period. The hippie period was starting to dry up as well. It was starting to change. The late 60s, movement was starting to fade away into a new dawn of something. And he himself would actually help, bring on this new dawn of sound, with the glam rock period. But early on into the 70s, stuff like this, as well as self-titled album, it was still uh, it was still kind of, it was the end of this sort of more gentle, sort of, early folky Tolkien-esque music that he was pushing for so long, and he wanted to go in a different direction. So really, at this point in time, you've got, up to now, just a quick recap. You've had Space Oddity from David Bowie, which is a hit single. Well, everything else pretty much Bowie had put out, you know, at this point has been pretty much a flop. Really, hasn't really made any impact. Bolan has had some successes with Tyrannosaurus Rex, but again, no real sort of success either. They've sold some records here and there, but generally, neither of them have really done anything huge, or none of them could be considered superstars or anything like that. They're very much languishing in the doldrums of music, with a fairly small but quite dedicated, I imagine, fan base. And then Bowie puts this out, Hunky Dory, one of the best albums ever made, and again, he doesn't have a great deal of success with it. I actually heard recently that this album was actually deleted by RCA. They stopped producing it effectively. At one point earlier, it got an initial run and that kind of thing, and then it got deleted, and then so it's kind of amazing, really, because this album got, Bowie put everything into this album, and it got good reviews and everything like that. And it's almost like, what do I have to do to become, a superstar? You put this out and people just shrug their shoulders and think whatever. And it's such a great album, and it was very much an album that, when Bowie did make it big with Ziggy Stardust, a lot of people went back and looked at this and thought, why the hell did we let this slip by? Why didn't we pay this more attention? And it kind of got more attention after, like a year after it came out, rather than the year it actually came out. So even with Hunky Dory released, he wasn't having any success. So really, with this album, his first album, he wasn't having any success. You can kind of say, well, what do you expect putting stuff out like this? But then, 1971, he's putting this out, and it's like, yeah, you're on Bowie's side. Definitely, he should be having a lot more success than he was, really, rather than being this kind of like underground artist. So the next record to come, that I'm going to be featuring is Electric Warrior. So this is really the big step for the pair. This is the first album to come out by either David Bowie or Mark Bolan that becomes a huge smash. This is the big moment for both artists. Nothing that kind of hit the shelves uh, as hard as this. When this hit, it really was a revelation. It was the start of glam rock, which both Bowie and Bolan would fully commit to for at least a while anyway. And yeah, this is the start of the success, and it kick-started everything. And when this came out, they were, Bowie and Bolan were pretty much level pegging with each other. They'd both had the success and the failures and that kind of thing. But then this came out, and Bolan just rocketed ahead and left Bowie pretty much in the dust. Bowie was just completely left behind, and I guess the huge amounts of jealousy that was existed at then, at that point, seeing his friend as well having all the success that he was dying to achieve, and it was just like, Bolan was just on a different planet at this point in time, which forced David Bowie to really dig deep and come up with this album, Ziggy Stardust. And he was, Bolan was ahead for a while, and in 1962 this came out, and Bowie pretty much caught him up again. So yeah, this is what I mean about the keeping up, the competitive nature of this sort of thing. If Electric Warrior wasn't such a great album, wasn't as successful as it was, would we have got this album? Would it have been as, we probably would have got it, but would it have been as great as it was? It's kind of debatable, of course, but I believe we probably wouldn't have got a Ziggy Stardust in the way that we did without Electric Warrior. And the fact is, David Bowie, listened and contacted Bolan, and was definitely you know in the frame when Electric Warrior was getting produced, and he definitely knew that he had to come up with something special, and he knew that the Bolan was onto something pretty good. He had a great eye for these type of things, and he may have been hanging around with him at this point. So yeah, it was definitely the start of the superstars kind of era. This is like, in terms of Bolan anyway, this is the high mark, and he'd follow it up with the Slider again, hugely successful, and this was again building momentum. So they kind of really did go from nowhere to being superstars very quickly. Bolan's self-titled T-Rex album came out, and then a year later Electric Warrior came out, and it was hugely successful. So in a very short space of time, he went from being fairly unknown to a great degree, not a household name, to being this huge superstar. And it really, and this is like like probably the highest point in terms of popularity. This album came out when Bolan was hugely popular, and it was the first album to do that, for Bolan. And, unlike Electric Warrior, which he was just, you know, he was just gaining that superstardom. This was the first album he had when he was a superstar from day one, and then the superstardom kind of continued to a certain degree, a lesser extent, with Tanks, a year later. But at this point in time, they're both doing fantastic. Bowie put out Pin-Ups, which was a successful record. And of course, A Lad Insane, hugely iconic. The thing is with this period, though, is you've got the sense that Bowie's on the he's on the electric sort of warrior, sort of tidal wave. He's riding that tidal wave, but there's kind of a bit more going on with Bowie than there is with Bolan. He's kind of feels like it's maybe a bit too easy for him, the glam rock, and that he's expanding his sound, in bigger and more impressive ways than Bolan. Bolan's kind of, much more narrow sound and much more, straightforward approach to things, whereas Bowie was kind of saying, okay, this is glam rock, we'll do some glam rock, and we'll do some other things as well. And you kind of get that feeling with something like Diamond Dogs, where it's got glam on it, but it's got experimental stuff, and there's just kind of a bit more going on, just generally, really. But then things started to kind of not go great, really, for Bolan anyway, unfortunately. He followed up Tanks with this album, the Zinc Alloy album, and this is where the wheels began to really wobble for Bolan, and he knew he had to kind of leave glam rock behind. He knew he had to change direction and look a different, pursue a different road, really. And he was the one who declared glam rock as dead and everything. The only real problem is that I get the feeling that he probably didn't really know where to turn, and he turned into a more sort of a more American sort of soul-based sound, more sort of Motowny sound with something like this, which is a bit of I believe a bit of ahead of the game of David Bowie with his next album, which we'll kind of get to soon. But it will kind of, whereas Bowie kind of could do it better and was more adaptable. Bolan wasn't, and it's a lot more. I find this a very sort of confused album, an album that I kind of can't really fully get behind. You know, I know there's fans of this out there, but for me personally, I've never been able to get fully behind it. And it's Bolan treading ground which he kind of doesn't feel comfortable in. He's trying to do something different, and it's just not really working out. And but he's still trying to keep a hand on the things that kind of brought him the fame, you know, the glam rock era. And he's trying to spread himself a bit too thin, really, and trying to be different but the same at the same time, which is never really a good idea. You know, where Bowie, on the other hand, you know, he completely ditched glam rock. It's like, I'm not going to keep a hand on her at all. Ziggy Stardust is dead. This is the new era. Young Americans are going to completely turn me back on the whole, type of music that kind of made me famous and Bolan famous and everything, and do something completely different. And I think this was the step that was the right step to take. You know, obviously in hindsight, it was the case. You know, just completely ditch it and do something different. Whereas as Bolan, on the other hand, he tried to keep a hand on it and tried to, he couldn't make that step away from it. Like the same, these albums, they got the similarities, but they're also very very different as well. And this one is a lot more brave and a lot more of a step in the right direction compared to this one, which is more of a step away from glam rock, but he's still got one foot left behind, sort of languishing behind, the times. And he really needed to ditch the glam rock, and he couldn't really do it the same way that Bowie could do it. So yeah. And then the next few years are gonna be pretty hard for Bolan, really. It started with the Zinc Alloy album, and then you got stuff like Bolan Zip Gun, and you got stuff like Futuristic Dragon. And at the same sort of time, Bowie's putting stuff out like this, station to station. In other words, Bowie is leaving Bolan behind. And for that brief moment in the early '70s when Electric Warrior came out, he was ahead of the game. He was ahead of David Bowie. Those days are well and truly over. Bowie at this point is just absolutely, pushing miles ahead. Not only is he overtaken Bolan, he's pretty much overtaken everyone. He's bringing out Low, and he's bringing Brian Eno into it, and he's bringing Heroes out. So far ahead of everyone, really. He was untouchable. And then 1977, same year Heroes came out. This hit the shelves, the final album from Bolan before he died. And coincidentally, before I forget to mention it, I was saying that earlier in this video that Bowie, he had different sorts of aspirations. He could have been a rock star if he wanted, but if that didn't work out, there was always like TV and things like that. Well, around this time, of Dandy in the Underground, late '70s, Bolan was actually, in it. He had a TV show on I believe it was on ITV, British television, and I believe it was a children's. I've actually seen some. There are some episodes on YouTube. While they're hopefully they're still up, and they're definitely worth checking out because it's such a bizarre show. It was a show that he did for children, effectively. It was a children's, after school TV program, and it's so kind of weird, such a strange show, and but it's kind of really, you can't really take your eyes off it as well. It's kind of like a train wreck, but it's kind of in a good way, I suppose, and it's just something else. It really is. It's just something else, and it's strange that Bowie could have fallen back on television if his music career didn't pan out, and it was his Bolan in the last few days of his life, effectively, on TV, and I believe one of the last episodes that of this TV show, which was called Mark, coincidentally, is David Bowie actually appeared on it. He was plugging Heroes. He actually performs Heroes on the show, and they have a little jam at the end, and then that was kind of like the last interaction that Bowie and Bolan had. And I believe one of the things that Bowie said after they met, was that it was such a waste. He felt like Bolan had just kind of wasted his talent, sort of thing. That he'd kind of sunk pretty low at this point. He was kind of his band had broken up. He'd fallen out with a lot of the band members. He'd fallen out with like Tony Visconti and everything, and he was kind of just a bit lost. Really, he was kind of a bit lost at this point in time. He was doing this kind of not particularly great kids TV show, and an early afternoon TV show or whatever, or late afternoon, should I say. And yeah, it was kind of, I guess he felt a bit sorry for him to a certain degree, and he knew how great he was, and he knew that there was a lot of more potential than the more he was kind of offering. But his career had kind of hit a pretty low point, and I guess the only way was up for Bolan. But it didn't really work out, unfortunately. And he kind of died soon after the release of this album, and that was kind of it, really. That was the end of the rivalry and the friendship as well. Most importantly, the friendship had ended, and it's kind of so strange the way it kind of worked out. They were level pegging for so long, and then one got ahead and the other caught up, and then just Bowie just kept going and going and going and going, and as every step forward, Bowie was taking, it was almost like Bolan was taking 5 or 6 back almost. It's just so strange the way everything kind of works out. And the talent that both of them had. I think it's just the adaptability that Bowie had. I think that was really key. The adaptability, the ability to kind of keep going and go and change your sound and build on something new and associate yourself with different people. That's what Bowie was able to do, whereas Bolan stuck to his guns to a certain degree and didn't adapt quite as much. Um, the people he was working with was ever diminishing. The talented people that he was working with kind of diminished one by one, and he was kind of left pretty much almost as a solo artist with a backing group. That's effectively what he was, which was kind of the case all along, but to a fairly lowly state, in my opinion. To what it was when it was at its height. So yeah, that's kind of it for this video. 30 minutes, a good old waffle. Hopefully you've kind of enjoyed this somewhat contrasting series of events in terms of David Bowie and Mark Bolan. Maybe I'll do this again for another couple of artists, but I think Bowie and Bolan are really the ones that I really wanted to do, because they were the ones that have so many connections with each other, and the fact that Bowie and Bolan they met up before Bolan's accident. It really does. It's almost like fate. It brought them together for that one last time. And it's kind of a bit sad, I guess, but it's just the way things go, unfortunately. So, thanks for watching, everyone, and goodbye.